In the summer of 1960, four teenagers, two boys and two girls, took their motorcycles and headed out for a simple weekend getaway, a short escape from the noise of the city. A small camping trip near Lake Bodom in the quiet town of Espoo, west of the capital. At first, everything was perfect. They laughed, relaxed, disconnected from their daily routine. It was supposed to be a peaceful, carefree summer night. But when the night ended, Finland woke up the next morning to one of the most horrifying news stories in its history. A brutal attack on the four teenagers, an event so shocking it shook the entire country, turning what was meant to be a harmless weekend trip into one of the most gruesome and baffling crimes in all of Europe's history. Welcome back! Today, I'm going to tell you the story of the Lake Bodom murders. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And let's try to hit 100 likes before the next episode. I'm counting on you. Our story begins in early June 1960 in the quiet northern country of Finland. Summer had just started. The weather was finally warm, and people were getting ready for weekend trips, picnics, and visits to the countryside. Among those excited to escape the noise of the city were four teenagers planning a different kind of holiday. Their names were Niels Gustafsson, Milla Björklund, Seppo Boisman, and Anja Maki. Niels and Seppo were two close friends, both 18 years old, while Milla and Anja were 15. And the two girls had recently formed romantic relationships with the boys. One day, they all agreed to go camping together beside a quiet, isolated lake somewhere peaceful, far from people and routine. At first, the girls' families refused. Their parents, especially Milla's father, were worried about letting their teenage daughters stay out in the wilderness with boys. But after pressure, arguing, and the usual "you're trying to control us" accusations teenagers throw, the parents eventually gave in. And so, on Saturday, June 4th, the four teenagers took their motorcycles and rode west of Helsinki toward a rural area known as the town of Espoo, completely unaware that this seemingly innocent trip would soon turn into one of the most infamous crimes in European history. Espoo was a small town, less than 530 square kilometers, known for its beautiful scenery. Forests, lakes, parks, and quiet nature trails. A place where people often went to relax, unwind, and spend their weekends away from the city. The weather was perfect, and the four teenagers had all their camping gear ready. As they rode through Espoo along a sloping hill, they spotted a lake called Lake Bodom, a popular spot where people swam, walked, and fished. The moment they saw it, they felt, this is the place. But before heading down to the lakeside, they stopped at a small kiosk to buy some snacks and drinks for the night. Inside stood an elderly woman, worn out, disheveled, and with a troubled look on her face. When they asked her for advice on where to camp around the lake, her entire expression changed. She stared at them for a long moment, then said coldly, "If you care about your lives, stay away from that area." The teenagers were confused. Her tone didn't make sense. They whispered among themselves. Maybe she was just an old woman talking nonsense, especially since she didn't look in the best condition herself. So they paid for their things, got back on their motorcycles, and continued their way. But something inside Milla felt wrong. A tightness in her chest. When she looked back toward the kiosk, she saw the old woman standing outside, watching them silently. Her eyes filled with something between fear and a warning, almost like a mother trying to protect her children. But with the excitement of the trip, the pressure from her friends, and the happy mood, Milla forced herself to ignore the feeling. She didn't want to ruin the moment. The four teens continued along the lakeshore, searching for the perfect camping spot. They wanted somewhere close to the water so they could swim and fish, yet isolated enough to give them privacy. Lake Bodom was massive. That's about 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, surrounded by tall, dense trees from every direction. After a bit of searching, they found the ideal location, a small natural peninsula jutting into the water on the southern shore. Thick trees around it acted like a natural curtain, shielding the area from anyone walking nearby. The moment they saw it, they said, "This is exactly what we're looking for." They unpacked their gear and began pitching their tent, barely big enough for all four of them. Slowly, Milla's anxiety faded as she settled in and saw her friends laughing and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. By the time they finished setting up, the sun was slipping away, and the warm colors of daylight began melting into the darkness of night. The perfect summer camping trip was just beginning, and none of them knew that this night would be their last. But because this was Finland, nighttime here wasn't like nighttime anywhere else. One of the country's most stunning natural phenomena appears in summer. The midnight sun, when the sun sinks down until it barely touches the horizon, then simply hangs there, refusing to disappear before rising again. That's why the sky never becomes fully dark. Instead, it turns into this warm twilight glow, a mix between sunset and sunrise happening at the same time. During that quiet, dreamlike light, Niels and Seppo took advantage of the calm and went fishing. By midnight, they lit a fire in front of the tent and started drinking until they were completely drunk. By around 2 a.m., exhaustion began to take over all four of them. Anya went inside the tent to sleep first, while Mila took out her diary and started writing everything that had happened that day. The last thing she ever wrote was that the boys were out by the lake, drunk, stretching, laughing, and dancing, and that she had never seen them this happy in her life. Hours passed, the endless Finnish night slowly melted away, and the summer sun began rising again over the shores of Lake Bodom. Around 11 a.m., a local resident named Esko Johansson went out with his children to swim in the lake. But as they walked toward the shore, excited to jump into the water, Esko spotted something unusual, a shape on the ground, a strange, dark pile lying near the water, almost like a heap of trash someone had dumped and walked away from. He was annoyed this was a tourist area. People shouldn't leave garbage here. He decided to go over and clean it up himself, but the closer he got, the more uneasy he felt. Something wasn't right. He told his kids to stay where they were, then slowly approached the pile. When he finally reached it, he froze. It wasn't trash. It was a collapsed tent, its fabric slashed open, torn in multiple directions, and splattered with blood. Fear gripped him, but he forced himself to look closer, and then he saw it. A teenage boy lying on top of the tent, his face and body covered in bruises and cuts, his legs bare and bloodied. Part of a girl's body was visible beside him. Motionless, Esko ran as fast as he could to the nearest phone and called emergency services. Within less than an hour, the entire lakeshore was packed with police cars, investigators, and reporters. Soon, the horrifying truth became clear. The boy Esko had found was Niels Gustafsson, lying on top of the collapsed tent, both legs exposed and severely injured. His face and skull showed signs of brutal blows, and his jawbone was broken. The partially visible body beside him belonged to Mila, and her condition was far worse. Her jaw and parts of her skeleton were shattered, and she had deep stab wounds across multiple areas of her body. Inside the tent were the remaining two victims, Seppo and Anya. Both had injuries and fractures similar to the others, but none of them suffered horrifying brutality to the extent that Mila had. It was clear that whoever attacked them targeted her with a level of violence far beyond the rest for reasons no one could explain. Strangely, when the police examined the crime scene, they discovered that the perpetrator had stolen seemingly trivial items: wallets, watches, and even the teenagers' motorcycle keys, despite not taking the motorcycles themselves. Clearly, there was no real motive for theft. Even more bizarre, among the missing items was Niels's shoe, but as the investigation expanded, the shoe was eventually found about 500 meters from the campsite, half buried under leaves and covered in blood, in the middle of an open, terrifying landscape. As investigators tried to piece together any clues from the scene, a shocking discovery stunned everyone. While examining Niels's body lying on top of the tent, they realized he was still alive. He moved slightly and let out weak moans. An ambulance rushed him to the nearest hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save him. If anyone could tell the story of what happened that night, it would be Niels, the sole survivor and the key to solving the mystery. He survived, but when he regained consciousness, the unimaginable had happened. He had completely lost his memory of the attack. All he could recall was a vague, shadowy figure through the torn openings of the tent. Every important detail, the appearance of the attacker, their voice, the sequence of events was erased from his memory. The investigation began slowly, trying to gather any clue that might solve the case. But from the start, it was riddled with critical mistakes. The first and most glaring: the police failed to secure the crime scene properly. There were no barriers, no caution tape preventing people from entering the campsite. Local residents and journalists constantly wandered in and out, unintentionally tampering with evidence. The situation worsened when the police called in soldiers from the army to help search for missing evidence like the murder weapon and stolen items, further crowding the forest and lakeshore. As a result, the chances of finding any undisturbed evidence were slim. The police were left largely relying on eyewitness testimonies. The first witnesses were two birdwatchers in the area during the early hours of the morning. They reported seeing a tall, blond man with a square jaw near the scene. behaving strangely and glancing around nervously. Their testimony was too vague to be conclusive. But then, a 14-year-old boy who had been near the lake around 6 a.m. came forward. He described seeing a man with a broad jaw and an arrogant expression close to the crime scene. The police began to suspect that these descriptions could indeed match the attacker. They decided to try an unconventional approach: hypnosis with Niels, hoping it would unlock any memory of the perpetrator. Under hypnosis, Niels described his attacker almost exactly as the eyewitnesses had: a man in his 20s or 30s, of medium height, with blonde hair combed back and a broad jaw. With these three accounts, the police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect. The shocking twist came when the press published photos of the funeral. Amid the mourners, a man of unknown identity appeared, his features closely resembling the sketch of the suspect. He stood among the crowd, calm and watching, and witnesses noted he seemed out of place. When police questioned the victims' families, none of them had ever seen this man before. As the investigation continued, the police began focusing on potential suspects. The first name that drew attention was a local man named Carl Gustafsson, 50 years old, the owner of the roadside kiosk where the four teenagers had stopped before heading to the campsite. And his wife? The mysterious old woman who had warned them to stay away from the lake. These details came to light when investigators read Milla's diary. It was her notes that had led them to pay attention to the old woman at the kiosk, and eventually to Carl Gustafsson. Carl was known in the area as an aggressive man, addicted to alcohol, and territorial about Lake Bodom, treating it as if it were his private property. He frequently caused trouble for tourists and visitors, throwing stones, cutting their tent ropes, or doing anything to make them leave. At times, he even fired a warning shot from a rifle to scare people away. Although Carl did not resemble the blonde man in the composite sketch, his personality and past behavior were enough to place him under suspicion. Moreover, his house was only 800 meters from the crime scene, meaning he knew the area well and could potentially escape unnoticed. However, after investigation, it was discovered that Carl was home with his wife and children all night on the day of the murders. His 12-year-old daughter confirmed this. As a result, the police excluded him from the list of suspects. While suspicions around Carl were settling, another suspect emerged. Hans Assmann, a 36-year-old German immigrant living just a few kilometers from Lake Bodom. His past was full of lies and fabrications. For example, he claimed to have been a Nazi guard during World War II, and later recruited by Soviet intelligence, claims that had earned him a reputation for deception and exaggeration. Hans came under scrutiny because he resembled the police composite sketch. When investigators questioned him, he claimed he had been in Helsinki with his girlfriend at the time of the murders. Both his girlfriend and her family confirmed his alibi, and he was ruled out as a suspect. Years passed, and investigators, as well as the victims' families, were losing hope. The case seemed unsolvable until August 1969, almost 9 years after the crime. Carl resurfaced in the investigation. By then, he was an alcoholic whose life had become a living hell. One evening, after a violent fight with his daughter, now 21, he confessed to her in a drunken state he was responsible for the Lake Bodom murders and could not forgive himself for what he had done. That same night, someone reported seeing Carl near the lake around 6 p.m., crying. Later, his body was found in the lake, drowned, some distance from the crime site. Initially, his wife tried to defend him, claiming he hadn't been involved and blaming his alcohol for any confessions. But over time, she admitted the truth. Carl had not been with her on the night of the murders, and her fear of him had kept her silent for years. She had genuinely believed he was elsewhere and never imagined he could be the killer. Despite contemporary media reports suggesting that Carl had killed himself out of guilt, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. In the same year, another potential suspect, Pentti Soininen, also died by suicide in prison. Before his death, he claimed he wanted to atone for his involvement in the Lake Bodom murders. He was later found hanged in his cell, removing him from the list of living suspects. The friend who heard this confession from Carl went to the police to report it. But the authorities did not consider him a suspect, as he was only 14 years old at the time of the murders. They didn't believe a young teenager could overpower 4 people, including 2 boys aged 18. So he was excluded from suspicion. By then, the only living suspect was Hans Assmann. In 1997, while on his deathbed, he confessed to a journalist about other crimes he had committed, but when asked about Lake Bodom, he refused to admit involvement. He died shortly afterward, leaving the question, did he truly have any connection to the murders? Unknown. The 1990s ended and the new millennium began. The Lake Bodom case had faded into history until April 2004, 44 years after the murders. Niels Gustafsson, the sole survivor, was sitting in his apartment when the police knocked on his door. They informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of his 3 friends. Thanks to major advancements in forensic science and DNA analysis, police had been able to re-examine the old evidence. This included Niels's shoe, which had been found some distance from the crime scene. Tests revealed that the blood on the shoe belonged to the 3 victims. None of it was Niels's own. Investigators concluded that the owner of the shoe had committed the murders. Niels spent a full year denying the accusations, claiming he could never harm his friends. But in August 2005, the long-awaited trial began in Finland. The prosecution painted a story. Niels, drunk and aggressive, allegedly got into a fight with Milla's boyfriend Seppo. Seppo tried to calm him down, but the argument escalated. Eventually, Niels allegedly grabbed a weapon while intoxicated and attacked all his friends, staging the scene to make it look like an external attack. The prosecution relied on 2 main pieces of evidence. Niels's shoe. The state of the tent. They argued that if Niels had been inside the tent with his friends, his body would have been injured like theirs. But all his injuries were concentrated on his head and face, and the brutality inflicted on Milla suggested personal anger, not random violence. As for the old hypnosis testimony about a blonde man, the court deemed it inadmissible, as hypnosis is not a reliable legal method. The defense, however, presented a powerful case. They argued that the prosecution portrayed Niels as a violent, calculating murderer, when in reality he was a loving young man in a moment of confusion and intoxication. The evidence painted a contradictory picture. The murders were carried out with precision to hide the crime, yet the prosecution claimed Niels acted impulsively. Importantly, Niels's injuries were severe: a fractured skull, broken jaw, and swelling that impaired movement and memory. Could someone in this state physically overpower 3 people, plan the murders, bury a shoe, and return to the crime scene to stage the scene? The defense argued, absolutely not. On October 7, 2005, Niels Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The Lake Bodom case remains one of Finland's deepest historical wounds, a mystery that still haunts the country. And so we reach the end of this story. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know in the comments which story you'd like us to cover next. If it gets enough engagement, we'll bring it to life in the same style. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share this video with anyone who would enjoy it. See you next time with an even more thrilling story.